happens when a wealthy man judges someone by their appearance, only to discover that his life depends on the very person he looked down on. This is a story about pride, prejudice, and redemption, a story that proves we should never judge a book by its cover. Los Angeles is a city of glamour, ambition, and towering skyscrapers. But behind the shimmering surface, shadows of prejudice often linger hidden, yet ever present. It was a bright morning in a bustling cafe, a place where the city's elites gathered to sip their overpriced lattes. In the corner, a man sat quietly, flipping through the pages of a small notebook. His skin was dark, his clothes simply sturdy jacket and well-worn shoes. His name was Jordan Hayes. To most, he would seem unremarkable, someone who blended into the background. But to those who noticed him, like Thomas Blake, he was a reminder of who they believed didn't belong. Thomas Blake was everything Jordan was not, or so he thought. Dressed in a sharp tailored suit and a watch that could pay for a small car, Thomas exuded confidence and privilege. He was the kind of man who expected the world to move aside for him. That morning, he walked into the cafe with the air of someone who owned it, his eyes scanning the crowd before landing on Jordan. Thomas frowned, his upper lip curling slightly as he noticed Jordan. He adjusted his suit jacket, as though brushing off invisible dust, and stepped into the line behind him. His impatience bubbled over almost immediately. He tapped his watch loudly and sighed theatrically, making no effort to hide his irritation. "I don't have all day," Thomas muttered under his breath, loud enough for Jordan to hear. Jordan glanced back briefly, his expression unreadable, before turning his attention back to the line. The cafe was crowded, the baristas overwhelmed, and the line moved slowly. When it was finally Jordan's turn, he ordered a simple black coffee. The barista, distracted and careless, spilled a bit of coffee on the counter as she handed it to him. Without a word, Jordan grabbed a napkin and cleaned it up himself. He didn't complain, didn't even make a face. To Thomas, this stoic demeanor was infuriating. "You are holding everyone up," Thomas barked suddenly, stepping forward. "Some of us have places to be. You can't just waste people's time like that." Jordan turned to him, his voice calm but firm. "I am just waiting for my coffee, like everyone else." Thomas smirked, folding his arms. "Waiting, huh? People like you should know better than to waste time in places like this. You don't belong." The cafe fell silent for a moment. A few patrons looked up, their faces a mix of discomfort and curiosity. Jordan stood still, his eyes locking with Thomas's for a brief second. Then, without a word, he picked up his coffee and walked out. Thomas scoffed loudly, his voice dripping with disdain. "Unbelievable," he sneered. "A guy like that walks into a place like this and thinks he belongs. This city really has no standards anymore." His words hung in the air, sharp and unyielding, as a few patrons shifted uncomfortably in their seat. A woman standing nearby leaned toward Thomas and whispered, "Do you even know who that man is?" Thomas scoffed. "Why should I care? He's no..." Outside, Jordan walked to a vehicle parked nearby. But it wasn't just any car, it was a fire engine. He opened the door, climbed in, and picked up a radio. His voice, calm and professional, echoed through the cabin as he relayed instructions to his team. Moments later, the truck pulled out, its sirens wailing, racing toward the next emergency. That evening, the quiet hum of Los Angeles gave way to chaos in a wealthy neighborhood. Thomas Blake's sprawling mansion stood illuminated against the night, the laughter of guests spilling out into the perfectly manicured lawn. Inside, Thomas was hosting a gathering. Friends, business partners, and family mingled, sipping wine and exchanging stories of success. Then it happened. A faint smell of smoke drifted through the air, unnoticed at first. But soon, the alarms blared, and panic set in. Flames began licking at the walls of the house, spreading faster than anyone could react. Guests screamed and ran for the exits, but Thomas and his family were trapped upstairs. The staircase was a wall of flames, each step disintegrating into ash under the relentless heat. Thick, suffocating smoke clawed at Jordan's lungs as he pulled his mask tighter, his ears ringing from the sound of wood splintering above. He knew he had seconds, maybe less, before the structure gave way entirely. Thomas clutched his daughter tightly, his wife beside him, their faces pale with fear. His confidence, his air of superiority, was all gone now. In its place was desperation. Outside, the sound of sirens pierced the chaos. A fire engine skidded to a halt, and the firefighters sprang into action. Among them was Jordan, his face hidden behind his helmet and mask. He didn't hesitate. As his team worked to contain the flames, Jordan entered the burning house, moving swiftly through the smoke and debris. Upstairs, Thomas's daughter coughed violently as the air grew thinner. Thomas tried to shield her, but he knew they didn't have much time. When the door burst open and Jordan appeared through the haze, Thomas could hardly believe his eyes. Without a word, Jordan scooped up the little girl and gestured for Thomas and his wife to follow. His movements were precise, efficient. He led them down a narrow hallway, through a shattered window, and onto a ladder waiting outside. Once everyone was safely on the ground, Thomas collapsed, coughing, his daughter clutching his neck tight. He looked up at Jordan, who had already turned back toward the house, heading in to search for more survivors. For the first time that day, Thomas was speechless. Thomas sat on the grass, clutching his daughter tightly. His chest rose and fell rapidly as he struggled to catch his breath. The fire raged on behind him, consuming the mansion he had spent years building, but none of that mattered now. All that mattered was that his family was safe. His wife knelt beside him, tears streaming down her face as she hugged their daughter. Thomas's mind replayed the last few minutes in a haze. The firefighter who had saved them there was something familiar about the calmness in his voice, the determination in his actions. It lingered in Thomas's mind. Then, like a jolt, he remembered. It was the man from the cafe that morning. The realization hit Thomas like a punch to the gut. Shame crept over him, cold and relentless, as he replayed every word he had said to Jordan that morning. The man he had dismissed, insulted, and looked down upon was now the one who had risked everything, his life, his safety to save a family who had shown him nothing but. He looked toward the house, watching as the firefighters continued their work. Among them, Jordan stood out, barking orders with authority, moving with precision. The flames reflected in his gear, making him look almost larger than life. For the first time in years, Thomas felt small. The fire was finally extinguished in the early hours of the morning. The once grand mansion was reduced to smoldering ruins. Emergency lights flashed across the scene as firefighters packed up their equipment. Thomas stayed on the lawn with his family, still processing what had happened. As the firefighters prepared to leave, Thomas spotted Jordan walking toward the fire engine. This was his chance. He stood, brushing soot off his suit, and approached cautiously. His steps faltered as he got closer. What could he say to someone he had insulted mere hours before? How could he express gratitude when he had shown nothing but disdain? "Excuse me," Thomas called out, his voice wavering slightly. Jordan turned, his helmet under one arm, his face streaked with soot. His eyes met Thomas's, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Thomas cleared his throat. I just wanted to say thank you for what you did tonight. You saved my family. You saved." Jordan nodded once, his expression unreadable. "It's my job," he replied simply. "No," Thomas insisted, taking a step closer. "It's more than that. You didn't have to go back in there for us." Jordan cut him off, his tone calm but firm. "We don't pick and choose who we save. That's not how this works." Thomas felt the weight of those words. He realized that while he had spent years categorizing people, placing them into hierarchies based on wealth, status, and appearance, Jordan operated on a different principle. To Jordan, every life mattered equally. "I owe you an apology," Thomas said after a long pause. His voice cracked under the weight of his own guilt. "For earlier today, at the cafe, I was out of..." Jordan looked at him for a moment, as if weighing his response. Finally, he said, "What you said this morning didn't stop me from doing my job tonight. Just think about..." The words were simple, but they carried a gravity that left Thomas speechless. Later that week, Thomas sat in his office, staring out at the Los Angeles skyline. The fire had left him shaken, but more than that, it had forced him to confront a version of himself he didn't like. He thought about Jordan, about the calm resilience the man had shown in the face of danger and in the face of prejudice. Thomas picked up his phone and made a call. "I need a meeting with the mayor," he said to his assistant. "And get me in touch with the fire chief. I have an idea." 1 month later, a new initiative was announced in Los Angeles. Thomas Blake, the wealthy businessman once known for his indifference to social issues, had pledged millions of dollars to improve conditions for the city's firefighters and to fund community programs in underserved neighborhoods. The initiative aimed to build stronger connections between first responders and the communities they serve. At the press conference, Thomas spoke candidly. "The fire that destroyed my home was a wake-up call. It reminded me of the bravery and humanity of those who serve us, regardless of who we are or how we treat them. This is just the beginning of what I hope to do to give back." Jordan was in the audience, standing at the back. He didn't care much for public attention, but he had been invited by the fire chief. As Thomas stepped down from the podium, their eyes met across the room. Thomas walked over, extending a hand. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to repay you," he said, his voice steady. "But I want you to know, you changed the way I see the world." Jordan shook his hand firmly. "Change doesn't happen overnight," he replied, "but it's a start." As the crowd applauded, Jordan turned and walked away, blending back into the sea of faces. He wasn't interested in recognition or accolades. For him, the job was never about it. It was about doing the right thing, no matter what. A few weeks had passed since the press conference. For most people, life in Los Angeles continued as it always did, fast-paced, driven by ambition, and often blind to the quiet sacrifices of others. But for Thomas Blake, something had shifted. He couldn't forget the fire, nor could he forget Jordan Hayes. The image of the man who had risked everything to save his family haunted him, not because of guilt alone, but because of admiration. Thomas had always measured success by material wealth, by power and influence. But Jordan embodied a different kind of success, one that didn't need validation from others. It was the kind of success that came from knowing you'd done something meaningful. One day, Thomas decided he couldn't let things end with a handshake at a press conference. He wanted to do more, not just for Jordan, but for all the men and women who put their lives on the line daily. Thomas reached out to the fire department and asked to shadow one of their shifts. At first, the request was met with skepticism. A wealthy businessman spending a day in the life of a firefighter? It sounded like a publicity stunt. But Thomas insisted. He wasn't looking for cameras or photo opportunities, he just wanted to understand. That's how he found himself at Station 47, where Jordan was. When Thomas arrived, the firefighters were polite but guarded. They weren't sure what to make of him. Jordan, however, greeted him with the same calm professionalism he had shown during the fire. "Didn't expect to see you here," Jordan said, raising an eyebrow. "I figured it was time I learned what you really do," Thomas replied. "If I am going to support your work, I need to understand." Jordan nodded. "Fair enough. Let's see if you can keep up." The day began with drills. Thomas struggled to haul heavy equipment and climb ladders, his expensive sneakers slipping on the worn metal rungs. The firefighters chuckled under their breath, but Jordan didn't. He watched silently, his expression unreadable. When Thomas stumbled while carrying a hose, Jordan stepped in, helping him lift it back into place. "It's not as easy as it looks," Thomas admitted, wiping sweat from his brow. "Nothing worth doing ever is," Jordan replied. By midday, Thomas had gained a new appreciation for the physical and mental toll of the job. But it wasn't until a real call came in that he truly understood. The alarm sounded, and the station sprang into action. Thomas was instructed to stay in the truck as the team responded to a car crash on the freeway. The scene was chaotic: twisted metal, shattered glass, and injured passengers. Thomas watched as Jordan and his team worked swiftly, extracting victims from the wreckage and administering first aid. One moment stood out. A young boy, no older than 8, was trapped in the back seat of a mangled car. The child's cries pierced the air as Jordan climbed into the wreck. Jordan forced himself to block out the chaos around him: the screams, the acrid smell of gasoline, and the distant wail of siren. His voice, steady but urgent, cut through the boy's sobs. "Look at me. We're going to get you out of here, okay? I need you to trust me." The boy's wide, tear-streaked eyes locked onto Jordan's, his trembling body slowly relaxing as he whispered, "Okay." When it was over, and the victims were loaded into ambulances, Thomas approached Jordan. "That boy," Thomas began, his voice shaking. "You didn't even hesitate." Jordan shrugged. "Hesitation costs livet. But how do you do it? How do you face danger like that over and over?" Thomas asked. Jordan looked at him, his eyes steady. "You don't think about yourself. You think about who's counting on you." Later that evening, back at the station, Thomas sat with Jordan in the break room. The other firefighters had gone home, leaving the two of them alone. "I was wrong about you," Thomas said finally. "Not just about you, but about everything. I've spent my whole life looking at people and seeing what I thought made them different from me. I've been blind to what really mattered." Jordan didn't respond immediately. He took a sip of his coffee before setting the cup down. "It's not about what you were wrong about," Jordan said. "It's about what you are willing to do now." For days after the fire, Thomas wrestled with himself. He wanted to move on, to convince himself it was just a brush with fate. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw Jordan's face calm, determined, unflinching, in the face of danger. And he heard his own words from the cafe echoing back, mocking him, "You don't belong here." The weight of it became unbearable, until one night he made a decision. Redemption wasn't a gift. It was something he'd have to earn. Jordan gave a small smile. "People like me. I mean people who see the world differently. People who understand what it means to put others first," Thomas clarified. Jordan leaned back in his chair, studying Thomas. "If you are serious, here is a lot of work to be done." Thomas extended his hand. "Then let's do." Jordan hesitated for a moment, then shook his hand firmly. Over the months that followed, Thomas worked closely with the fire department, not just funding new initiatives but also volunteering his time. He partnered with Jordan to launch programs that brought firefighters and community members together, breaking down barriers and building trust. For Jordan, it wasn't about recognition or praise. It was about seeing people come together, rich and poor, black and white, side by side. And for Thomas, it was about redemption, about proving that change was possible, even for someone like him. One evening, as the sun set over Los Angeles, Jordan and Thomas stood outside Station 47, watching children play in a new community center funded by their effort. As the city lights flickered to life, Jordan glanced at Thomas, his expression unreadable. "You've come a long way," he said quietly. Thomas looked out at the horizon, where the sun was setting behind the cityscape. For the first time, the view didn't remind him of power or status. It reminded him of second chances. He smiled faintly, his voice steady. "And I am just getting started." The laughter of children filled the air, a reminder that change, no matter how small, could ripple into something far greater. Jordan chuckled softly. "You had a wake-up call. Don't waste." "He won't," Thomas promised. And as the city lights flickered to life, both men knew they had started something bigger than themselves, something that might just change the world, one step at a time. This story reminds us that appearances can be deceiving, and true character shines brightest in moments of crisis. Have you ever judged someone too quickly, only to discover their true worth later? Share your thoughts or experiences in the comments below. Let's start a conversation about courage, humility,